Once upon a time, America was the world's manufacturing powerhouse. America made 50% of the world's goods. We supplied most material for both world wars, and 1/3 of all American jobs were in manufacturing. America was great. Factory workers created a strong middle class, communities thrived, and even corporations saw long-term success. But somewhere along the line, things changed. We stopped being so great. Manufacturing got shipped overseas, towns got hollowed out, and the middle class has been struggling to keep up ever since. I mean, in 2025, only 8% of American jobs are in manufacturing. American manufacturing is dead, and it's becoming one of the biggest debates in the country. We talk about bringing jobs back and rebuilding the middle class, as if we can just turn back the clock, and we've been taking desperate measures to do so. But what nobody is talking about is, why did manufacturing leave in the first place? What were the events that unraveled that caused us to become a service-based economy? Well, in this video, that's the story I want to tell, because going from a country that makes things to a country that buys things wasn't random, but there was a series of events that created that shift. And so to understand how it all went wrong, we need to turn back the clock and go back 150 years ago, when America was beginning its rise to becoming the world's industrial powerhouse. Chapter 1, The Awakening of the Giant. Our story begins in the 1880s. The US overtook Great Britain to become the largest manufacturer in the world, producing 24% of the world's manufactured goods in 1900. America was becoming the industrial giant, and that was partly due to its scale. It was a vast country rich in natural resources. We had the infrastructure to transport goods around the country by rail, and high tariffs were protecting American industry from foreign competition. And as we progressed in the 1900s, America learned how to be extremely efficient, with Henry Ford creating the assembly line, where he went from producing a Model T car from 12 hours to 93 minutes. And the assembly line eventually became the modern model for manufacturing, because this increase in productivity enabled mass production and lowered the cost of goods. America had the infrastructure and systems to scale up at a moment's notice, and its first test came in World War I, when America became the biggest manufacturer of wartime supplies, making military vehicles, ships, and explosives. And once the war ended, these wartime factories seamlessly transitioned to making radios, cars, and appliances. And by the late 1920s, America produced 40% of the world's manufactured goods. But of course, we all know what happens next. The Great Depression started, where unemployment goes up and factories slow down. But the infrastructure remained intact, waiting for its next moment, and that moment would come a decade later. Chapter 2, The Arsenal of Democracy. The next part of our story begins in 1940. The world is underway fighting in World War II. But at this time, the US is still neutral and isn't fighting in the war. But President Franklin D. Roosevelt says America must be the arsenal of democracy, where we will supply allied nations fighting for democracy with war materials. And just like World War I, America mobilizes, and consumer factories like GM, Ford, and Chrysler transition back into making tanks, planes, and Jeeps. And production productivity is unlike anything the world has ever seen before. On average, America is making 6 to 7 Liberty ships a day, and 1 B-24 bomber every single hour. But in 1941, with the bombing of Pearl Harbor, America enters the war. And with the men off fighting in war, for the first time in history, women, African Americans, and immigrants start filling assembly lines to keep the arsenal of democracy moving. And by the end of the war, America produced almost 2/3 of all Allied military equipment during the war. I mean, from 1940 to 1945, we produced 297,000 aircraft, 86,000 tanks, 2 million army trucks, and 193,000 artillery pieces. And at the end of the war, we secured our spot as the strongest economy in the world, having nearly half the world's GDP. And if that weren't enough, manufacturing was at its height in America. By the end of the decade, America produced half of the world's manufactured goods. And this will just keep going up. Chapter 3, the only factory left standing. By the end of the war, America was producing half the world's manufactured goods. Cars, steel, appliances, if it was made, it was probably made in the USA. And this trend would continue for a while because we had an advantage that other countries didn't have. While Europe and Asia were left in ruins, America's factories stood untouched, shielded by oceans. That meant that we basically had a monopoly over manufacturing, and the world desperately needed us. I mean, between 1948 to 1952, under the Marshall Plan, we provided Western Europe with over $13 billion to rebuild their economies. Which really benefited us because they would use that money to buy our manufactured goods, and the money would flow right back in the US economy. Manufacturing was booming in the USA. Steel, cars, chemical, and appliance production reached record highs, which created more jobs for Americans. And by the early 1950s, 1 in 3 of all jobs were in manufacturing. And at this time, a single income could provide a home, a car, and a vacation for a family. This post-war era is the time that many people look back on as America being great. But as America was starting to get comfortable, other countries had rebuilt their economies and were starting to catch up. And we were about to face competition like never before. Chapter 4, Competition Arrives. This is the point of the story, where America is at the height of its greatness. However, it's undeniable to say that we didn't get here solely on hard work and skill. No, there was tons of luck involved that no other country experienced. First, we had an abundance of natural resources to build up our country. Second, during the world wars, we had no enemies nearby. And 3, we had 2 giant oceans protecting us. It's very easy to be number 1 when you face no competition and every other country is being bombed. But once the free market opened and competition started to arrive, we realized we weren't as good as we thought. By the 1960s, Germany and Japan have rebuilt their factories. And competition started to disrupt American manufacturing. One of the biggest disruptors was the German Volkswagen Beetle that became the top imported car in 1960 due to its affordability, fuel efficiency, smaller size, and quirky look. And by the early 70s, American cars were starting to become a lot less desirable due to 1973, when OPEC placed an embargo on the US for supporting Israel, which quadrupled the price of gas. And when the price goes up that much, what are you going to do? You're going to look for more fuel-efficient cars. And American cars, as good as they looked, did not get good gas mileage. The 1973 Ford LTD only got 13 miles a gallon, while the Japanese 1973 Honda Civic got over 30 miles per gallon. And when America tried to compete making smaller cars, the cars sucked and there were many safety issues, like the Ford Pinto exploding. And by 1980, Japanese auto share in the US was 18%. And the Japanese focused on precision and quality and made stuff that was a lot better than our stuff. For example, Sony made TVs that were cheaper, lighter, and sharper than American-made TVs. And by the mid-70s, Asian TVs were 30% of the market. And then came the biggest warning sign of them all. During World War II, the US had a trade surplus, meaning we exported more than we imported. But by the late 70s, we had a trade deficit, meaning we imported more than we exported. And just as America was losing ground to foreign competition, an invisible force came to disrupt it even more. Chapter 5, The Curse of the Almighty Dollar. By the late 70s, the American economy was in the toilet, and we were met with something called stagflation, which is slow economic growth, high unemployment, and high inflation. Inflation was above 10% multiple times in the 70s. And to combat this, Federal Reserve Chair Paul Volcker declared war on inflation and raised interest rates to record highs at 20%, which was called the Volcker shock. And after a recession, it did lower inflation. However, it came with an unintended consequence. The dollar became an attractive foreign investment. It was seen as the safest place to park your money. And at the same time, President Ronald Reagan focused on cutting taxes and increasing defense spending. And because of this, the federal government ran a deficit, meaning they were spending more than they were taking in. And what did they do to cover the difference? They started to sell more bonds, attracting more foreign investment in the US dollar. In fact, under Reagan policies, the national debt nearly tripled. And this attraction to the US dollar made its value soar. From 1980 to 1985, the value of the US dollar increased by 50%, which was a big problem for manufacturing because that basically meant that every American export now cost 50% more. America was pricing itself out of the market and it was becoming too expensive to compete. And we tried to fight this in 1985 when France, West Germany, Japan, the UK, and the US signed the Plaza Accord to devalue the US dollar. But at this point, it was really too late because factories were already closing and manufacturing was dying. But at the same time, business leaders were changing their priorities. They were starting to turn against their own workers in the pursuit of profit. Chapter 6, Americans Against Americans. For decades, American companies saw themselves not just responsible to their shareholders, but to the workers, customers, and communities. But by the 1980s, that all changed, and America started to turn against itself. And it all started with a man named Milton Friedman, who wrote a famous article in the 70s saying that the social responsibility of business is to increase its profits. And workers started to be seen not as partners to invest in, but as expensive labor that should be cut. And a man who really put this idea into practice was named Jack Welch, who was the CEO of General Electric. Jack Welch took Friedman's idea to an extreme and started cutting workers, closing down factories, and outsourcing labor to cheaper countries. He later became known as Neutron Jack, where like a neutron bomb, he eliminated people while leaving the building standing. And although this hurt American workers, it pleased shareholders as Friedman suggested. And General Electric's stock price soared, ultimately making him Fortune magazine's Manager of the Century in 1999. And over time, other companies followed this model. Nike went to China, IBM went to Asia, and Whirlpool moved to Mexico. And this made CEOs rich. In 1965, the average CEO made 20 times more than their worker. But by the late 80s, that ratio had jumped to about 60-1. Inequality was rising, and the middle class was being left behind. Americans were turning on their own Americans in the name of profit. And at the same time, Washington was opening the door even wider. Chapter 7, The United Continent of America. Now, I'm sure that we've all heard of NAFTA, which allowed free trade with Mexico, Canada, and the United States, which was signed into law by Bill Clinton. And basically what ended up happening is American companies sent their factories south for cheaper labor. But as simple as that sounds, I think that this topic deserves its own chapter because it's a much deeper story. Although Bill Clinton signed it into law, it only occurred 11 months into his presidency. So it's safe to say that NAFTA was not Bill Clinton's idea. Instead, the idea of free trade in North America started with one of the biggest advocates of free trade, Ronald Reagan. And so let's hear his vision in his own words.
And so a developing closeness among Canada, Mexico, and the United States, a North American Accord, would permit achievement of that potential in each country.
Reagan was the one who wanted free trade in North America, and his first step towards it happened in 1988 with the Canada-US Free Trade Agreement that eliminated most tariffs between Canada and the US. And that laid the foundation for NAFTA, but at that time his term was ending. But that is the moment when his vice president, George H.W. Bush, steps in. And in 1990, Bush invited the Mexican president, Carlos Salinas, to Washington to negotiate trade with Mexico. And then the Canadian prime minister entered negotiations, and they all reached an agreement on December 17th of 1992, still awaiting for Congress approval. But Bush didn't win a second term, so he wasn't the man who signed it into law. However, during the '92 election, his independent candidate, Ross Perot, warned America what would happen if NAFTA was signed into law. And this is what he said.
There will be a giant sucking sound going south. So if
people laughed at him, and he didn't win the election. Instead, Bill Clinton won the election. And although Clinton was a Democrat, he was a new Democrat that was more moderate and pro-business. And 11 months into his presidency, after congressional approval, NAFTA was signed into law, despite his own party calling it a betrayal to the working class. In fact, 60% of House Democrats and over 50% of Senate Democrats voted against it. And that's how NAFTA was created. And shortly after, we heard that giant sucking sound as many companies moved their factories south of the border. And millions of American manufacturing jobs disappeared. But then, halfway around the world, another country was tempting American companies, offering even cheaper labor. Chapter 8, China, the knockout punch. At this point in the story, American manufacturing has been beat up. It's bloody, it's weak, and it's barely standing. And that's when China steps in to deliver the knockout punch. But to understand how it happens, we need to go back 50 years ago. Back then, China was poor, isolated, and stagnant. But in 1978, that all began to change under the leadership of Deng Xiaoping, who wanted to reform China and open China up to the world. And he created special economic zones that welcomed foreign investment, offered tax breaks, and fewer restrictions. Basically, these were cities that specialized in different types of manufacturing, like Shenzhen, that made electronics, Wenzhou, that made shoes and clothing, and Foshan, that made furniture. And as China started to build these manufacturing cities, companies who only cared about profit couldn't resist doing business with them due to their dirt cheap labor and extremely fast production. And fast forward to 2000, and Bill Clinton starts lobbying Congress for permanent trade relations with China, as he believed making Chinese trade more stable would encourage deeper trade, investment, and grant China's entry into the World Trade Organization. And when it was voted in, his fellow party didn't really agree with him, with 65% of House Democrats voting against it. However, the Senate was more bipartisan, and only 19% opposed it. And it was signed into law on October 10th of 2000 by Clinton, and China entered the World Trade Organization about a year later. And that was the knockout punch. Economists estimate that over 3 million American jobs were lost to trade with China, most in manufacturing. Chapter 9. Welcome to the service economy. In the 1950s, 33% of jobs were in manufacturing, but in 2025, that number is just 8%. And what came in its place? Well, nowadays, instead of clocking into a factory, more Americans now punch at Walmart, Starbucks, or log into a gig app. We live in a service economy, and service jobs don't create a strong middle class like manufacturing jobs did. Instead of working in a factory, earning a livable wage, benefits, and having stability, most Americans find themselves with service jobs with low pay, no benefits, and little stability. And although the GDP keeps growing, many Americans feel like they're running in place, being more productive than ever, but not having their wages keep up. America went from being the factory of the world to a service economy, and the middle class was left behind. And so let's finish this video off with Chapter 10, Where Do We Go From Here? What a story that was. This is probably going to be a long one, but I believe that every detail in this video was crucial to understanding the story. We started out as the factory of the world, but over time we were outpaced by competition, reshaped by culture, and undone by policy. And so the question is, what do we do with all this information? Well, if there's just one thing that I've personally been learning making these historical video essays is that real stories are always more complex than the media and politicians want us to believe. And let me remind you that I am no economist or historian. I am a YouTuber who went down a rabbit hole, and now I am presenting to you what I learned. And so, as always, I want to finish this video off with 3 takeaways that I personally learned making this video. 1. Americans killed American manufacturing. If you look at common debates on this topic, we love to point fingers and say that American manufacturing disappeared because of Mexico or because of China. But what I learned from this story was that it was really an inside job. What really killed American manufacturing was American policies, American greed, and American selfishness. We love to blame others in this country, but the truth is, we did this to ourselves. 2. An America united is always stronger than an America divided. When you look at this story, what really killed us wasn't just foreign competition, but it was when we started to turn against each other. Manufacturing was at its peak, when Americans worked together during the wars for a common purpose. But once unity gave way to division, the foundation began to crack. This isn't just a story about factories, but it's a story about our culture. And if we want America to be stronger, it starts with remembering that an America united is much stronger than an America divided. And finally, being American is still a privilege. Before I became a YouTuber, I was a Peace Corps volunteer teaching English in Ecuador for 2 years. And Ecuador is a beautiful country with wonderful people, but that experience was challenging. For 2 years, I never felt safe. I saw so many people suffering, and I learned what it means to live with a low quality of life. And that experience really gave me perspective. It showed me how much we take for granted here. We have safety, stability, and opportunity. And even though it doesn't always feel that way, even though the mainstream media loves to tell us that this country is falling apart, compared to most of the world, we still have it incredibly good. And if you don't believe me, hop on a plane and go to somewhere much less fortunate, spend a day there, and you will quickly realize America isn't perfect, but being American is still a privilege. Thank you so much for watching. Making these videos requires an incredible amount of work, so if you value the work I put into this video, please give it a like, subscribe for more videos like it, and if you want to hear another very interesting story about how boomers killed the American dream, give this video a watch next, because maybe they didn't actually really kill it. And with that, muchas gracias, que tengan un buen día, nos vemos chicos.